Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Thompson, and I'm the Interim Curatorial Director here at English Heritage, and I'm your host for this evening's Members Lecture. This is the series that takes you right to the heart of heritage, with insights and stories directly from our expert historians and curators. Tonight, we'll discover the story of one of our most peculiar and one of our youngest sites, the Cold War bunker in York. Now, in September 1991, members of the Royal Observer Corps, the ROC, closed the door on their Group Control Centre in York for the final time. For 30 years, the Corps had stood ready for nuclear war. Their role was to observe, measure, and monitor the impacts of bombs detonating across the country. With the collapse of the Soviet Eastern Bloc, the Cold War threat receded, and the ROC role was deemed no longer necessary. Using testimony from the observers themselves, this lecture will document the end of the Cold War through the prism of those ROC volunteers and the building that they staffed. It's a story of service and a story of pride, of memories and of friendships, and of how the Cold War's end may be symbolised in a half-used bottle of washing-up liquid. So to tell us this story is Senior Curator Kevin Booth. Kevin is an archaeologist and a curator working across areas from the Neolithic to the Cold War. His recent work has focused on exploring the ways in which we can reappraise the legacy of archaeological archives within our collections and developing a research framework for a major human remains assemblage and, of course, establishing an oral history research project around the Royal Observer Corps. But before I hand you over, just 3 quick housekeeping points. First, you can send us your questions by sending us a message on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll aim to cover as many of these as we can at the end of the lecture. Second, during the lecture, a donation button will pop up on your screen. Now, as a member, you already do so much to help us share the benefits of heritage with as many people as we possibly can. But if it's something you're able to do, please consider making a donation to help us make even more of a difference. Thirdly, we're joined again by our British Sign Language interpreters who are helping us to make these lectures as accessible as possible. And as ever, we're broadcasting live, so please bear with us if we have any technical issues. And if sound is a particular issue, after the lecture, you'll be able to watch them in the members area of the website with subtitles. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand you over to Kevin.
Thank you, Matt. Good evening, members. In the early summer of 1991, Anne and Tony Metcalfe returned from holiday. Both were members of the Royal Observer Corps. They'd met through the Corps, shared a wide friendship group through the Corps, and had devoted a large part of their adult life to the organisation and its aims. Anne for 27 years, Tony for 32. Back at home in Leeds, Anne received a phone call from her father. He rang me up, she recalls, and said, "It's a pity about the RSC, isn't it?" I asked, "Why? What's happened?" "Well, they've just stood you all down." "We had no idea," she said. "Nobody saw it coming." In September 1991, as the Cold War was seen to finally end, the majority of the RSC was stood down. For Anne and Tony and thousands like them, the pace and abruptness of stand down was a shock and an upheaval. This lecture, the last in a series loosely framed around a moment in time, takes the stand down of the Royal Observer Corps in 1991 as a reference point from which to explore the motivations, experiences, and emotions of a group of people who gifted a significant part of their adult lives to being prepared for the unthinkable, a nuclear war. Drawing on English Heritage's oral history and documentary archives and on conservation, conversations, and correspondence from across the last 20 years, I hope to convey something of the army of volunteers who, for over 35 years, trained to be ready for Armageddon in the hope that society could emerge at the other side. This is an account based largely on the memories of 20 or so personnel. The focus and themes I've chosen to work with are, I think, inevitably selective, but for anyone watching who served with Ukumo, I hope you'll find a story that at least in part aligns with your own experience. Ukumo, the United Kingdom Warning and Monitoring Organisation, was formed in 1954 in response to the terrifying threat of nuclear conflict. Part of the Home Office, Ukumo sat alongside a number of other voluntary organisations such as Civil Defence or the Women's Royal Voluntary Service, all working to protect and support the civilian population after a devastating attack. Ukwemo's primary role was to confirm that an attack had occurred through identifying a bomb's ground zero, its power, and the passage of resulting radiation. Ukwemo teams would analyse the data to advise civil and military institutions and inform the civilian population on whether it was safe or not to emerge from shelters. The organisation engaged small teams of volunteer scientists called warning officers to carry out that analysis, but it turned to an existing group, the Royal Observer Corps, to operate its network of bunkers across the UK. The Observer Corps had been formed in 1925 as part of the RAF. It gained its royal title in 1941 for the critical role played in identifying enemy aircraft, calculating their height, speed, and direction to predict a likely target and arrival time, giving advance warning of attack to urban populations. That role had depended on a web of observation posts across the entire UK, structured into geographic clusters and reporting to regional controls. Ukwemo adopted the network model. For a decade from 1955 onwards, the organisation commissioned over 1,500 monitoring posts spread across the United Kingdom. These tiny underground concrete chambers were clustered by geographic region into operational groups and coordinated by larger group controls. Initially, Yorkshire had been served by 2 controls, but from 1968 onwards, 20 group control, built in the western suburb of York, Acombe, coordinated over 40 monitoring posts from Spurn to Settle, Redcar to Doncaster. 20 Group was formally opened on the 16th of December 1961. Built by Shepherds of York, now more familiar as the brand Porter Cabin, its brutalist mass concrete was largely hidden beneath a smart grass mound, which was just a gleaming white entrance block visible at the top of a straight line of stairs. The similarity with another of York's iconic buildings was not lost on the Earl of Scarborough. Addressing invited guests, he opined, "It's perhaps not a very flattering comment on our modern world that we have here, close to York, another mound to be used for defence against a possible enemy. You've one mound in the middle of York, Clifford's Tower, but here we are in 1961 and we've got to build a new sort of mound." Today we use the word bunker, a word that carries connotations of the mysterious and secretive, a dark, perhaps dank space, otherworldly, catastrophic. In reality, 20 Group Control was a brightly lit office without windows, a functional, ordered space where around 60 highly skilled workers would employ the roles they'd been trained to carry out. Inside was a kitchen with a huge oven to feed the crew, a canteen, both ladies' and gents' toilets, 2 dormitories to sleep 14 at a time, and a plant room and air conditioning system. At its heart, however, was a split-level operations room where the pattern of a nuclear attack would be marked out in triplicate. Had that ever been a reality, the staff would have been locked in, locked down, and self-sufficient for 30 days as the world around them descended into chaos. Monitoring posts were very different. Tiny concrete chambers set 15 foot underground and accessed by ladder down a narrow shaft. They could be located on open moor, on boggy ground, near an urban centre, or utterly isolated. Fred Tyman worked for a small contractor in Whitby, charged with constructing posts at Castleton and Osmotherley on the North York Moors. When I spoke to him in 2012, he recalled undertaking everything from initial concrete shuttering to fitting wall cupboards and desks and applying a final whitewashing of the internal walls. He said, "We put 3 coats on with a 6-inch brush. You needed sunglasses in there by the time we'd finished." Fred said it was only much later that he learned what the curious structures were for. He said he would not have liked to have been in there. He'd have preferred to be at home under the bedclothes with the missus. If the challenge with group control was keeping it cool, then the opposite was true for posts. Monitoring posts retained an ambient temperature of around 12 or 13 degrees. It never varied, said Gordon Fallowfield, come summer or winter. At his Strensel post, the cool chamber was a bonus on a hot day and meant an escape from the mosquitoes on the surrounding common. Winter was different. Some report wearing pyjamas beneath their full uniform. John Walls at Guiseley would often have a couple of pullovers under the RAF jacket, a shirt, 2 pairs of socks. As John noted, on a full 8-hour shift, after the first hour when you'd set everything up, the cold just sort of seeped into you. Many posts were in isolated and exposed locations. Training and maintenance, though, took place every week of the year, and it could be very difficult to get to them in the winter. The metal entry hatch could become weighed down with snow or some even less predictable forces at rural sites. Anne Metcalfe described an incident at a post in the Yorkshire Dales. The hatch wasn't as prominent as some of the posts, so it was nearly at ground level, and this cow decided it would sit on it. They couldn't open the hatch and they had to call for help. Someone had to go out and move the cow off the top of the hatch. Facilities were basic and cramped. A small stove to cook on, the ration packs, though observers would often take their own food, bunks for 2 people, chairs, and a portable Elson toilet tucked away from the main chamber that had to be carried up the ladder and emptied, neither very private nor pleasant. Nobody wanted to take it out, Gordon recalled. Fortunate then that his mum lived nearby, so for Strensel Post observers training for nuclear war, they could pop into the local village day or night to use the Fallowfield parental closet rather than have the indignity of the Elsen. The Uckermore system depended on maintaining a flow of recruits to its observer and warning officer roles. At its peak, the RSC nationally called on 25,000 people, 600 alone required for 20 group, even after restructure in 1968. Recruitment stands would be manned at events and fairs, and talks given to local organisations. Word of mouth was an important mechanism. Reasons for joining up varied a great deal. In the early 1970s, John Walls attended an air show where the RSC had put on a display. He was a young man with plenty of energy and time, and he understood the nuclear threat. He thought the RSC seemed like a useful organisation. Ron MacDonald, then based in Inverness, responded to a recruitment drive by the Scottish Office for Warning Officers. Many of those in the 1950s and into the early 1960s had been in the forces in World War II or served with national service and saw an opportunity to continue their commitment to safeguarding the country, along with an attachment to a disciplined, uniformed identity. Others in that early period were attracted by the aircraft recognition role, which remained an important aspect of training through to the later 1960s and could mean more direct contact with the RAF, sometimes a visit to a base, seeing the planes close at hand, even a trip out in one of the trainer aircraft. Others in that early period were attracted by the aircraft, Age 16, Noreen Delaney had hoped to join the RAF, but her father would not hear of it. When she met a cousin proudly wearing her ROC outfit, Noreen was sold. As a 16-year-old, I had no other motivation than a nice royal blue Air Force uniform. For others, there were family connections. David Rogers' father was based at the Leeds Control, and David would spend summer holidays there or travelling out with his dad to inspect the monitoring posts. He'd always expected to join the RSC himself, but having completed an engineering degree, David signed up, aged 23, as a warning officer with Uckermore, serving at Sector Control in Lincoln. For others, the RSC offered a peer group and a friendship. Anne Metcalfe reflected on having just left school and started working. She said she missed her friends. You go from an environment where you know a lot of people to being at the bottom of the heap in the working environment, and I was looking around for some kind of big youth club. A friend suggested I try the RSC, and I went there, and I was hooked. Ralph Whitelock claimed at the age of 15 he was one of the first mercenaries in the Royal Observer Corps. He'd intended to join the Boys Brigade, but a friend told him about the Corps, that the uniform was free, you didn't pay subs, they paid you. Oh right, he said, I'm in. How do I join? There were many other reasons. One ex-officer, who perhaps will remain anonymous, though you know who you are, Tony Metcalfe, told us he joined because he was interested in a girl. As this was oral history, I don't know whether his tongue was in his cheek. Jim Millington, Commandant at 20 Group, told me he could always tell who would take to the Corps and who would stick with it. Many would come and go quickly, but those who got it, he said, really got it. Jim felt it took a certain sort of person. He himself had joined in the early 1960s, serving until stand down. He was 20 Group Commandant for almost a decade, a paid part-time role he maintained alongside his full-time job with British Telecom. Several evenings a week, Jim would drive across the group to isolated posts or join crew meetings at the control, ensuring logistics and welfare for over 500 people under his watch. A certain sort of person indeed, yet that of itself is an interesting statement, as the RSC was necessarily not an organisation of a certain sort of person. The staff posts that spread across Yorkshire with thinly populated rural areas or more diverse urban centres, the Corps drew from what was then termed blue and white collar and administrative professions, creating groups of people who might not otherwise have mixed. At 31 Post, Kirby Hill in North Yorkshire, Gordon Whitehead, then Assistant Secretary at the Yorkshire Regional Examinations Board, was joined by a steel fabricator, a salesman for a Harrogate furniture shop, and a driver from the local Territorial Army depot. Now, this is not to suggest that the Corps presented the sort of diversity or inclusivity that we now actively work towards, though there was a fairly equal gender split in terms of numbers, even if the entry age for girls at 16 was a year older than that for boys. Over time, leadership roles opened up for women officers, leading observer, chief observer, group officer, and Metcalfe talks with great pride at being the first female group officer in charge of a cluster of posts. Personal experience might be different. Eileen Whitelock felt herself to be stuck in the house, having had her first child. She joined the ROC wanting something different. Another of her children was almost born in the control. I went right through pregnancy, went to every meeting and every exercise. One night I was sitting next to my friend and I said, "Just time these pains, will you?" And she said, "Every 4 minutes." And I went, "Oh." Took the bus from the group control back to Leeds, then caught a bus from Leeds to where I lived, and then rang the ambulance. Her then husband didn't really want her to go to training and made things quite difficult. Ultimately, her relationship with the Corps outlasted that marriage. Anne Metcalfe had been in the Corps a few years earlier before she met her first husband. He just accepted it, she says, though perhaps didn't take it very seriously until she was promoted to officer and took him to a formal dinner. He went as her guest, and I think it was the first time he realized I wasn't just playing at things. So if not just playing at things, what were they doing? At the posts, observers focused on providing rapid, accurate, and ongoing reporting of information into the control. The rumble of explosion would be followed by a blast wave, striking baffle plates on the roof and twitching a needle on a dial below, giving a measurement of overpressure in pounds per square inch. At that confirmation of a strike, one of the post crew would ascend the ladder, flipping the hatch, armed with a leatherette wallet known as the handbag, to collect a series of light-sensitive sheets from the ground zero indicator, essentially a large metal drum that acted as a pinhole camera, and providing orientation and altitude relative to the post location. This post-specific data is fed through to the control, received by a suite of post-display plotters sat on a balcony in the ops room. Observers would be trained in a wide range of roles, in part to keep their service fresh and in part to ensure flexibility dependent on who could attend. New recruits tended to be put onto post-display plotting, as it was seen as quite a basic role, simply requiring the transcription of bomb data and passing this up to the next level. And yet it was also a role that required excellent communication skills. Noreen Delaney spoke to us about the importance of the plotter interacting down a telephone line with a colleague who might be out in the wilds. That two-person relationship was critical. Ralph Whitelock echoed this, noting that one slip in the transcription would invalidate all the data that about the bomb and its progressing impact. Ralph spent much of his time on the triangulation table, the next stage in the process. I was lucky in that I found a job I really liked very early on. Being part of the triangulation team just appealed to my nature. We'd receive a report of the bearing from a post, and all that post knew was it had seen a flash on a certain bearing, and that in itself, that is relatively easy. But if enough posts saw the flash, and obviously they came from a different direction, and if we knew where that post was, then using the triangulation table with those post locations on, we drew a line along the bearing from each post as to the way the flash had occurred. And where those lines intersected, that must be the bomb. And I loved the triangulation. I got so good, I mean, eventually, and I'm talking years, you could actually stand me in front of the map with the bomb pressures, and I'd tell you where the bomb was, and I'd give you an estimate as to whether it was a ground burst, an air burst, and a rough idea of its pressure. That triangulated information was then communicated to the sector control, from where the exact data was sent to other group controls and agencies. Within 20 Group, the bomb's geographic location was recorded on large display screens. Posts continued to feed in live data on radiation levels recorded on the rear face of those large display screens. Martin Bishop, a member of the warning team, was on the other side of the screen. He said he was interpreting the data in the light of prevailing weather conditions and sending out warnings. All very hands-on, he said, and clunky, but we were afraid of using computers as they were vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse given out by explosions. In this way, the public could be warned as to when to stay indoors and when it may be safe to venture outside. How then does someone train for this? The roles, but also mentally, emotionally. For both ROC and warning officers, this was a huge commitment. The control was not staffed all the time. Observers at the control were split into 3 crews, each training on a separate night of the week, warning officers every 2 weeks. Should the threat ever rise to a critical level, then crews would staff the control in a rotation of 8-hour shifts, and if the threat became imminent, those inside closed the door on themselves. That threat never rose, and the control was never staffed for real. Volunteers were provided with training manuals to be worked through in their own time and at weekly sessions. A series of examinations were sat, including the compulsory annual master test, for which a mark over 90% gained was called a master pass and was awarded a blue Spitfire badge. 5 more such passes earned a red Spitfire, and for 25 master passes, and remember these were annual tests, the award was a coveted gold Spitfire. Alongside the weekly commitment was the chance to attend a summer camp, usually held at an RAF base. Across 6 weeks, several thousand ROC members would undertake week-long training camps, which itself meant using precious annual leave from work and spending time away from the family. These were hugely social events, and the oral history accounts present vivid and often hilarious accounts. Ralph Whitelock, I'm referring to the ambulance story, but I think that is probably another lecture. Lastly, a series of national and international exercises were staged over 12, 24 or 36 hours. Held on weekends, these, like the camps, are rich in ROC folklore, stories of bulk orders of fish and chips, a picnic out on the grass bank with blankets and wine glasses on a fine day, even visits to the pub. At Strensel Post, on a 24-hour exercise, it was the single lads who took the night shift, remembered Gordon Fallowfield. They go to the pub until 11, then come on shift the final 8 hours to dawn, armed with a few beers to see them through. The regularity of training helped them form close-knit friendship groups, itself adding to the strength of the corps. Crews developed their own social identity, carrying that relationship into their everyday lives and activities. Romantic relationships were born out of the corps, memories were forged and anecdotes perfected. You remember the time she did such and such, and the look on what's his name's face? Camaraderie then was essential to be able to do a good job. As Noreen said, if you don't get on with the people you work with in a given situation, then your life is 10 times harder. Perhaps an understatement if you think they could be locked in a concrete tomb for 30 days. The uniform status of the ROC gave members a clear, common and public identity. Though transferred under the Home Office, the Corps still wore hand-me-down RAF issues. Until the mid-70s, this was a World War II battle dress, less than fondly remembered as the Hairy Mary on account of the intensely itchy woolly fabric. This was replaced by a smart new Barathea outfit in the 1970s. Allegedly designed by Norman Hartnell, the jacket, recalls Gordon Whitehead, was a windcheaper design with a zip front and no means of adjusting the waist size. It fitted where it touched. It had 2 slant breast pockets, which would not take much more than a packet of 10 cigarettes if you smoked, and then that would be in one pocket, and a cigarette packet and a box of matches or a lighter in the other. In was the operative word, as once the things were in, it was almost impossible to get them out. Your hands were at an angle of about 45 degrees when you put them in the pockets, and once you got hold of, say, that packet of cigarettes, you couldn't get your hand out unless you let go of that packet of cigarettes. Strensel Post had a sign on the back wall. In case of nuclear explosion, 1, cover your eyes. 2, bend forwards. 3, kiss your backside goodbye. There was, Gordon Fallowfield says, a lot of dark humour in the Corps. If you look too much into it, and there his voice tails off on the recording. Corps members and warning officers had a much clearer understanding of the impact of nuclear war and the post-nuclear world than most of the population. It'd be wrong to assume, though, that those in Ukumo were in any way in favour of the bomb. Occasionally, they'd be challenged by members of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, mostly peaceful process, though direct action was not unknown, such as supergluing monitoring hatches shut, observers in or not. Those I've spoken to generally viewed CND as misguided. When we asked Noreen about CND, she sighed. Oh, all they were bothered about was ban the bomb. Oh, ban the bomb. You're involved with the bomb. But we weren't involved with the bomb, she said. We were trying to eradicate it. In his 1961 address, the Earl of Scarborough believed, everyone will agree that we hope this new headquarters will never have to function operationally. But everyone with any sense will further agree that it is necessary and wise precaution that these arrangements should be put in hand, in case there is anybody mad enough or wicked enough to launch nuclear warfare on the rest of the world. What of that threat? How did it affect those who served 20 Group? In their own words, Anne, it was serious if it had ever happened. We've been in terrible trouble. There'd be no going back. David Rogers, I think you just put it into the back of your mind, you know, it shouldn't happen, and the more you prepare for it, the less likely it was to happen, because that was the nuclear deterrence. Ron MacDonald, who worked for the Inland Revenue. I wanted to be part of something that could help the rest of the population without a lot of song and dance. Who knows, there might even have been a role for an inspector of taxes when it was all over. Tim Kitchen. I think I was of the mentality that we can't magic away this threat. There is a threat, and if there is a threat, then what can we do about it within that broader concept of deterrence? Noreen Delaney. It wasn't a case of having your head in the sand. You knew that it could happen, and that would be the end of the world as we knew it. But at the same time, in case it wasn't, you had to have a defence that would help. David Simpson, 20 Group Chaplain. Well, I do remember thinking when I joined up, it would be great if there was no Royal Observer Corps, because there'd be no threat. Jim Millington was adamant he would have manned the control if the call came. It was a fact of life and something he prepared for. Arrangements were made for families to look after each other, or, as David Rogers described, go to relatives in more remote areas. He said, I'd arranged that my wife and family would have gone to stay with her parents. They came from a farm over on the coast near Skegness. I always said that, well, if the balloon went up, they'd go there when I went to the control. For Noreen, the decision was, she says, easy. She only had a husband at the time. She would have gone, and he would have done something to help. Anne Metcalf did have a young family. She would have gone, she says, but hoped that the bomb dropped directly on her house. For Eileen Whitelock, speaking 30 years after Stand Down, it felt a little less clear cut. As a family, we were prepared. I mean, I got loads of tins of things and I knew where we were going to build a shelter. But would I have gone if we were called up? You know, with three small children, would I have gone to the group headquarters? I always say I would, but when it came down to it, would I have gone? I just don't know. In the summer of 1991, the RSC was preparing for a royal review marking 50 years since being awarded its royal title. Noreen remembers the event with great pride. The Queen and the Duke were there, so that was very special because quite a few of us were presented to the Queen and we had a chat with her, which was super. But as the autumn edition of the RSC Journal lamented, the occasion would have been perfect, but for the knowledge that the Corps was shortly to stand down and pass into history. Because on the 11th of July 1991, a memo was sent round to group commandants announcing the results of a review into emergency planning and civil defence. The monitoring and warning role, played by Ukumo and the ROC with it, would be ended. As the journal's editorial put it, reactions among members have ranged through sadness and resignation to anger that a service freely given with no thought of reward should be ended in the name of economy. Ours has been a unique organisation blending patriotism with comradeship and public service, qualities which once dispensed may not easily be reassembled. Now, Anne Metcalf had said that she never saw it coming. A number of others from the ROC and UCMO have suggested that it seemed inevitable and they left the service early, not wishing to be within its death throes over the last few months. Some have even said that leaving stand down was in some way a relief, because after 10 or 20 years every week, it gave them perhaps a route out rather than another 10 or 20 years serving with the Corps, as sad as it was. David Simpson gave a particular point of view. He said that stand down was more a long wind down, that after many, many years, every week being reminded of the horrors of what might happen, it took him months longer to release himself from that anxiety, that sense of stress that perhaps he hadn't realized he'd been living under for so long. The Berlin Wall was breached in November 1989, 5 days after 5 million people had gathered on its eastern side. The next 2 years saw the collapse of communist rule in Eastern Bloc states and a succession of Soviet republics ceding from the central authority. And with the collapse of the communist system, the world closed the chapter on the Cold War, and the bunker door was closed and locked. A final gathering of the crews, photographs taken, a social event, and then that was it. Other than basic maintenance, the building was left abandoned, its contents untouched and unmoved. Notices, cups and trays, manuals, screens, maps, furniture, loudspeakers, hooks and hoses. Amongst all this, the echoes of service and people, a coffee cup stain, handwritten note, a temporary fix or a localized solution, and a half-used bottle of washing up detergent sat by the sink. Museums and archives across the globe hold totems of the Cold War's end. Iconic photographs and film footage, Trabant cars, ID papers, and of course chunks of the Berlin Wall. Indeed, you wonder if there's more concrete in museum stores around the world than was ever used to build the thing. In York, the seismic global shift is marked in the undisturbed capsule of 20 Group control. One day a critical element in Britain's capacity to survive, the next a relic of a period past, suddenly obsolete and irrelevant. Many now argue the Cold War has never ended, that the nuclear threat remains, and while global politics changes arena and focus, madness and wickedness, as the Earl of Scarborough said, remain ever present. Unfinished business, perhaps, depending on your point of view, half finished, plenty still to come, like the washing up bottle. In 1986, the Royal Observer Corps Association was formed as a means of providing support to ex-observers and their families, and a benevolence fund to support them if they were in trouble. After stand down, the association became ever more important, a link back to that social group, back to that sense of purpose. And over the last, 33 years, it has continued. And it's due to members of the association, their unstinting support for English heritage, that we were able to open the York Cold War bunker, as we now call it, and to present it in the way we have. I'm deeply grateful to all of them. This lecture has been for you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for this lecture, Kevin. It's, as ever, fantastic to be able to share ongoing research into such an important episode in our history. And I think particularly exciting for us to hear the voices, the real voices of the people who've been involved in this, well, at times terrifying, but clearly absorbing volunteer role. So now it's very much over to you with your questions. We've had a lot in already. Do keep them coming in. And I will kick off with the first few that have come through. This one from Esther. Apart from this particular one in York, are there any other bunkers that I'm able to visit?
There are, Esther, yes. Though there are no other Royal Observer Corps group controls. There are in Scotland, to be perfectly honest. I should correct myself. There are regional seats of government that are open, RAF rotar stations, that are a whole series of them around the country. But the 20 group control, I have to say, is very special. I did talk to some specialists in the field, and they suggested it's one of the three sort of really authentic survivals of a Cold War interior from that period, and it sits up there because of it being closed up and locked, and it is just this capsule, extraordinary space.
Fantastic. So yes, there is more, but actually,
well, we would say,
not that we're saying Kevin is in any way biased. Thank you. Something very specific, actually, and as a curator, hopefully this will be of interest. What are the big differences in dealing with items from this period that you don't necessarily get with archaeology as we would normally understand it?
Golly. There's materiality. So we're dealing with plastics, we're dealing with early rubbers. They give off gas. They don't like the chemicals on our fingers if we touch it. All they want to do is degrade. So there's a sort of conservation, a collections management aspect, which can affect the way you have public access as well. You know, allowing people to get close to things, but hoping that they don't touch it. But there's a kind of aspect of dealing with a collection like this. You're dealing with this tight 30-year period. And you're dealing with archival documents, written documents, as well as, you know, oral history accounts. And you've almost got a truth staring at you. Whereas with archaeology, sometimes you might be looking at 300 or 400 years and you sum it up through a little bit of pottery and you say, there we go, that was that period, thank you very much. And there's sort of an inference with archaeology in the sense that you can draw conclusions. Perhaps with a subject like this, you're rather more constrained, if that's the right word, by the very evidence staring at you.
And the very people who you're speaking to, who can contradict you.
Who may well be about to write a question to say, we didn't agree with what you said, Mr. Booth.
Let's see as we go on. There's some of these questions are clearly sort of stimulating an awful lot of very wide-ranging thoughts. So I'll throw a couple of these out here. Do you know if the Soviet Union had a similar network of warning and observation facilities?
Oh, goodness. I should be able to answer this off pat. And I can't, because I can't remember.
That's okay.
Because across Europe, there were different mechanisms. Now, the Observer Corps did international training exercises. And one of the great display boards that you've seen in the photograph on the presentation there was of Northwest Europe. And it's looking at the impact of the war going on there as well as at home. There's nothing quite like the Uquamo network, as far as I understand it, across other countries, or indeed in the Eastern Bloc. There's quite a lot of work going on now looking at exactly how the Eastern Bloc responded, and some of that is turning into Cold War tourism agendas and the ability to go out, just as you come to the group control, to go out to Eastern Bloc and visit those sites, which has, I think, a very different feel because of the the world of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and the constraints and the secrecy, etc.
Yeah. So more to be done, and also I would say that we will try and answer questions once this session's finished. We haven't managed to get through them all. Try and put some more fulsome answers out there. Very short question here, just 3 words. Why 30 days? It's from Alistair.
And was it really 30 days? You know, they had a large tank of diesel fuel. They had a huge water tank. They had rations. Nominally, with 40, 50 people down in that group control, 30 days is a given sort of period. But depending on how quickly the bombs stopped falling, you were into a position where you're monitoring radiation and you're tracking radiation. The role of the Uquamo warning officers particularly was to understand where clouds of radiation are moving, at what altitude, at what speed, and at which point the rain is likely to come down. And after 2 weeks or so, 2.5 weeks, the half-life in the radiation I think gets to the point where it's not really worth measuring from that point. So 30 days, it could well have been less. And at that point, you open that bunker door, then what?
Well, there you go. Well, absolutely. So resources, but there's other reasons behind it, and there's more more nuanced answer.
I suppose if nuclear conflict was going on seriously into the weeks, then 30 days or 300 days wouldn't make much difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Something here about the actual core itself. Do we know how many ex-members of the core are still out there?
Well, the association knows how many, and I think the figure for 20 Group is in its mid-40s of members, perhaps more, but active members. Yes, time is moving on. Next year is the 100th anniversary of the Observer Corps, which English Heritage is hoping to support the association to commemorate. The RSC is a curiously sort of, even at the time, invisible organisation, little known by the general public. It's not one of those organisations that has this great sort of, legend about it. But what an extraordinary service they gave. Next year's the anniversary. We must support that. But I think it's very interesting to know how many more ROC veterans there are who never joined the association, who've never told their story. And, at some point, I'd like to reach beyond those who stuck with it to those who perhaps would be dredging something up that they haven't really thought about for a long time.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, interesting your response there. Excuse me. A message in here from Siobhan, who says, very interesting. Thank you so much. My mother, an RAF wife, served in the ROC at Watford during World War II. It sounds as if volunteers didn't have to keep it secret. Or did they have to sign the Official Secrets Act during the war or later?
You see, I'm just being exposed to my lack of research here. On the oral history and in, written and talking to, yes, they signed the Official Secrets Act, but I don't know whether I've actually ever seen that in an archive document. And there'll be people out there who are screaming at me saying, well, of course, or of course not. But I confess, I've never actually formally confirmed that. And if they had signed that, they've not, no one's yet sort of used that as a reason not to give us all oral history. They've not felt a need to disclaim on it.
Yeah, fantastic. Here we go. Okay, Jeanette comes with a question of, are there any complete surviving monitoring posts? I've seen the ruined survivals, but not any complete examples.
There are. That kind of goes back, I suppose, to Esther's question right at the beginning. Are there other bunkers you can go and see? And there are many three-man monitoring posts where enthusiasts, either ex-ROC or those who've, become affiliated with the ROC, have, reconstructed, represented, refurnished posts. One of the ones I mentioned, Fred Tyman, in the talk, he built the one on the post at Castleton, and that's now open periodically. And actually, sometimes when I drive across the moor, you see people queuing to climb down the hatch. Do you know, I've been working with that bunker for 19 years. I've still never been down a three-man post. And there are two, at least, on English Heritage properties. We don't know exactly where. They've been capped. Scarborough and Whitby headlands. So we're hoping perhaps part of next year, part of the centenary, we might just go looking for the Scarborough post and see what's in there.
You're setting yourself up with a 3-year research agenda, I think, from these questions, which is fantastic. Sticking with the kind of the physical entity of the bunker itself, question came in about how quickly could these bunkers be built?
Again, another one I should know off by heart. The three-man posts were constructed really quite quickly. It's a question of how quickly the concrete cures on each pour. So once that's cured and you can get the next layer in, they go up pretty quickly. They're all to a standard format. It depends whether you're digging in, soggy clay, which you then have to, do something about, or whether you've got hard rock that you've got to quarry through. And I think there are some locations where they did change the design just because the ground was simply impossible to work with. But for, pretty short time, matter of weeks, for a 3-man post, group control, looking at a lot longer. It's a pretty dense structure to go up.
Yeah. Okay. Right. But not perhaps not months and months and months.
Well, as I say, they're building 1,500 across the country using small local contractors, but they do take 10 years. It's not a full-time operation. I think they make decisions. Oh, actually, we could do with infilling a gap here. We've always intended to put one over there. We will manage that.
Okay.
The last of the bunkers was of the monitoring posts was built not long before great reorganisation in 1968, and I think that one was then promptly closed.
Right.
So it lasted a couple of years.
So they weren't static; they were changing, which leads us neatly, actually, onto a question from Madeline. And this might be somebody that you maybe have spoken to. The control room changed over the years that I was a member of the ROC. How did you decide what period to portray at Acom?
There was quite some discussion. There's a little anecdote I'll come to, Madeline, as well on that. Precisely because it had changed over a period of time. What we inherited was its last incarnation, and to rewind that and present it as a mid-1960s or an early 1970s structure would have actually meant removing quite a lot of material. Sure. And also because it was this capsule where nothing had moved, that to represent it at a different date would mean taking that apart. And that just, from a curatorial point of view, seemed entirely wrong. And I'm glad we held to that decision because we now retain, as I say, one of these 3 extraordinary interiors from that period. I nearly put into this talk an oral history from, I think it was a chap called Dave Douthwaite, and he remembered that before they had the huge perspex screens down in the well, down in the operations room, they had sort of tall, slanted, almost like architects' boards where they recorded the position of the bombs. They were metal boards with magnets on, and depending on the training night, and probably to do with the humidity in the space, over a period of time, the magnets would start drifting down the board, so your record of nuclear conflict was sagging in front of your eyes. They changed that system.
Well, if I've been saving this one for last, it's not actually, it's more of a comment than it is a question, but we are coming towards the end of our time. And this is from Sally, and she says, "Thank you for telling something of our story. I can still write backwards on a vertical surface really quickly from my time at the plotting screens in number 12 group HQ in Bath." And I think that's in terms of the comments and questions we've had coming through, I think that's a lovely way to end it. And I'm afraid that brings us to a close for this evening. I'd really like to thank you all for joining us tonight. We'll be sending you a link with a short survey just to hear a little bit more about your thoughts and understand what topics you're interested in to learn more about. We'd be really grateful if you could spend just a few minutes to fill it in, and it really is just a few minutes. Thank you. And remember, all of our lectures are available to watch in the members area of our website. And I'd like to say thank you once again to Kevin for such a fantastic lecture. And thank you to all of you, our wonderful members. And it only thanks to you that we're able to care for all of these sites, such as the bunker, and to share the tales of the people who work there. And an extra special thanks goes to those of you who've donated this evening. Everything you give really does make a difference to our work. I'd like to say thank you and good night.